She did not steal money. She did not break a law. She did not start a fight, disrespect the household, or embarrass anyone with the Caldwell name. Avery Caldwell did one thing. She walked to the gate of her father's $500 billion mansion, the same gate she had walked through every day of her 24 years of life, and she handed a homeless man sitting on the cold sidewalk 2 buttered rolls, a banana, and a thermos of hot coffee. That was it. That was the crime. And for that single, quiet act of human decency, her stepmother Diana Caldwell grabbed her by the hair inside her own bedroom, struck her twice across the face with ringed hands, and threw her out of the mansion she was born in, with $43, a backpack, and bruises still burning on both cheeks. Diana laughed while she did it. She laughed because she believed she had already won. Because she believed she had already buried every threat, silenced every witness, and locked down every document that stood between her and the $500 billion empire she had spent 3 years stealing from a grieving widower who had made the fatal mistake of trusting her. She laughed because she thought the homeless man at the gate was nobody. He was not nobody. He was Theodore Harmon, her deceased husband's personal attorney of 22 years. The one man Marcus Caldwell had trusted above his board, above his accountants, above Diana herself. The man she had threatened into hiding 6 months earlier to stop him from surfacing the one document that could destroy everything she had built. Theodore Harmon had spent 6 months living as a displaced man, no phone trail, no address, no digital footprint for Diana's hired fixer to track, not because he was running, because he was waiting. Waiting for the moment the probate filing was irrevocable, waiting for the legal vault timers to expire, waiting for the court date to lock into place. And he had one final thing he was waiting for, something Marcus Caldwell himself had written into the will before he died. A clause so specific, so deliberate, so devastatingly personal that the moment Theodore stood in that courtroom and read it aloud, Diana Caldwell's entire constructed world would begin to collapse in real time, in front of judges, journalists, and federal investigators, with no exit and no escape. Marcus Caldwell had known his wife was dangerous. He had prepared for her anyway. And the instrument of her destruction had been sitting 60 feet from her front gate on a Thursday morning in October, cold, gray-bearded, and patient as a sealed verdict, right up until the moment his stepdaughter walked across the lawn and handed him breakfast without asking for anything in return. That one act of kindness was the final condition Marcus had written into the will. And Diana had just fulfilled it by beating the girl and throwing her out. Now ask yourself this: what kind of man writes his daughter's compassion into a legal document, and what did he know about his own death that made him do it? What is inside Clause 9 of that will? And how does a woman who controlled a $500 billion empire end up losing absolutely everything because of 2 buttered rolls and a thermos of coffee? Stay right here. Because this story is not just about karma. It is about a father who loved his daughter so much, he kept protecting her from beyond the grave. The Caldwell estate sat on 47 acres of manicured Connecticut land, and from the outside, it looked like something the world had agreed to leave untouched, iron gates standing 12 feet tall, ivory columns gleaming at the front entrance, rose bushes arranged in deliberate color gradients from cream to deep crimson along the interior path. People drove past it slowly. They always did. Not because they expected to be invited in, but because beauty of that magnitude demanded acknowledgement even from strangers. Avery Caldwell had grown up inside those gates. She was 24 years old, 25 in 11 weeks, and she had never once confused the estate's beauty with safety. Not anymore. She stood at her bedroom window on the 3rd floor on a Thursday morning in late October, watching the frost settle across the east garden, and she pressed 2 fingers to the glass the way she used to as a child when her mother was still alive, and the cold outside felt like something separate from her, something that could never actually reach her as long as Eleanor Caldwell was in the world. Eleanor was not in the world anymore, had not been for 12 years. Avery had her mother's cheekbones, high, elegant, the kind that caught light even in dim rooms, and her father's eyes, a brown that shifted between amber and shadow depending on what she was feeling. She was slender but not delicate. She had learned the difference between the two the hard way. Delicate things broke under pressure. Slender things bent and held. She was the kind of woman who noticed what others walked past. The housekeeper's tired shoulders on a Monday morning, the way a room's temperature changed when certain names were spoken, the precise moment when a smile stopped being genuine and became performance. Her mother had taught her that. Avery Caldwell had believed that real attention, freely given, without motive, was the most honest form of love available between people. She had lived that belief in every room she entered. She had remembered the name of every staff member's child. She had kept a handwritten birthday list in her desk drawer and never missed a single one. The Caldwell estate, for all its cold architectural grandeur, had been warm because Avery existed inside it. And when Avery died of breast cancer at 41, swift, merciless, no meaningful warning, the warmth had died with her. Marcus Allen Caldwell had been one of the most powerful men in America. His company, Caldwell Global Holdings, operated across 17 industries on 4 continents. The man had shaken hands with presidents, restructured failing economies in emerging markets, and turned a modest northeastern manufacturing firm he inherited at 32 into a $500 billion empire by the time he was 50. Financial publications called him visionary. Competitors called him relentless. His employees called him exacting but fair. He was all of these things. But inside the 47 acres of the Caldwell estate, what Marcus Caldwell was above everything else was Avery's husband. And when she died, the most essential part of him went quietly underground. He grieved for 4 years. Avery had witnessed every season of it. She had been 12 when her mother died, old enough to understand what she had lost, young enough that the loss reshaped the architecture of who she was becoming. She and her father had rebuilt something in those 4 years, smaller than before, quieter but real. They ate dinner together every Sunday without fail. He taught her to read financial reports on Saturday mornings, the way other fathers taught their daughters to ride bikes. He called her Bertie, a nickname that had originated from a sparrow that had flown into Avery's hospital room, the morning Avery was born, and perched on the window ledge for an hour as though it had somewhere important to be, and had simply chosen to delay its departure. Avery had laughed, weak and radiant simultaneously, and said the bird was clearly waiting to meet her daughter. Marcus had called her Bertie from that day forward, and he never once stopped. Then came Diana Whitmore, and everything that had been quietly, carefully rebuilt began to come apart at the seams. She had appeared at a Hartford charity gala in the spring of 2019, 38 years old, precise in her beauty, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who had calculated every variable in a room before entering it. She had a law degree from Georgetown she had never practiced, a wardrobe that cost more than most people's annual salaries, and a backstory constructed with the care of someone who understood that the right narrative was worth more than the most expensive outfit. She told people she had been through a difficult first marriage and had rebuilt herself. She made it sound like resilience. She wore it like a credential. She had made Marcus Caldwell laugh within the first 40 minutes of meeting him. Not a polite laugh, a genuine one, the kind that required the whole face and came from somewhere unguarded. Avery would learn this detail later from the event photographer who had caught it on camera. She would study that photograph and feel the cold move through her, because she understood what Diana had done. She had not led with attraction or elegance or wealth. She had led with laughter. She had identified the precise door her father's grief had left unlocked and walked straight through it. Avery had met Diana 3 weeks after the gala. She had watched her for 2 hours at a dinner Marcus hosted and said nothing, cataloged everything. The way Diana's eyes moved across the room even while speaking directly to someone. The way she touched Marcus's arm at intervals that were too precise to be unconscious. The way she asked Avery about her mother with an expression of practiced sympathy that never once reached the back of her eyes. After dinner, when Marcus stepped away to take a call, Diana had turned to Avery with a different expression entirely, brief, appraising, the measurement of someone confirming a calculation, and then replaced it instantly with warmth so convincing it would have fooled anyone who hadn't already seen what lived underneath it. Avery had told her father the truth that same night. She had sat across from him in his study, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, mahogany desk, the framed photograph of a leaner on the corner credenza that Marcus had never moved, and she had spoken plainly. "Dad, I don't trust her." Marcus had set down his reading glasses, taken her hand, and smiled with the particular patience of a man who believed he understood something his daughter did not yet. "You'll warm up to her, Bertie." He had believed it completely. That was the thing about grief-softened men with ironclad professional instincts. They could read a balance sheet in the dark and miss what was sitting directly across the dinner table. Marcus Caldwell married Diana Whitmore in June of 2020. He was dead 18 months later. The official cause was heart failure, a cardiac condition his cardiologist confirmed had been developing quietly for years, accelerated by chronic stress and the long erosion of grief. There had been no investigation. No whisper of one. Billionaires died of heart attacks. It was, unfortunately, a well-established pattern. Life moved forward with the indifference it always showed toward private devastation. But 3 weeks before Marcus died, Avery had walked past his study and caught 4 words through the door before the silence swallowed them. "Theo, make it airtight." She had not known who Theo was. She had filed the memory away in a part of her mind she could not yet access, buried it under grief, and gone on living inside a mansion that was already, without her understanding it, transforming from her home into something else entirely. Something with locked doors and invisible walls and a woman in a silk robe at the center of it, rearranging every surface a leaner had ever touched. The funeral for Marcus Caldwell was attended by 600 people, and Diana Whitmore Caldwell wept at the graveside with the precise volume and restraint of a woman who understood that grief, performed in public, was a form of credibility. She was dressed in black Valentino. Her makeup was flawless in the way that required preparation. She accepted condolences with a soft, devastated gratitude that made people reach for her hand and squeeze it. A senator's wife leaned to her companion afterward and whispered that Diana Caldwell was handling herself with extraordinary grace. 2 board members from Caldwell Global Holdings found themselves feeling protective of her before the reception even began. Avery stood 12 feet away from Diana at the graveside and watched all of it and said nothing. She wore her mother's pearl earrings, the small ones, the ones a leaner had saved for ordinary Sundays rather than special occasions, because she believed the best things should be used, not preserved. Avery had put them in that morning with hands that weren't entirely steady, and she had pressed 2 fingers against the cool pearls before leaving her room, and she had whispered something too quiet for anyone to hear. She had not cried at the service. Not because she didn't feel it, the grief was a physical thing, a weight distributed across her chest and shoulders that made it faintly difficult to breathe, but because something else had installed itself alongside the grief. A vigilance, a watchfulness she couldn't name yet but could not set down. Diana moved within 48 hours of the funeral. The first thing she did was contact Preston Whitfield, the lead attorney of Whitfield and Associates, a firm Diana had introduced to Marcus 8 months before his death under the narrative of modernizing the estate's legal infrastructure, replacing his longtime counsel with quiet, strategic efficiency. Preston Whitfield was a gray-suited man in his mid-50s, with a specific kind of professional cordiality that existed primarily to smooth the passage of unfavorable documents through rooms full of people who should have asked more questions. He had convened the reading of Marcus Caldwell's last will and testament 4 days after the funeral. The document gave Diana primary control of the estate and all its holdings. It allocated Avery a monthly stipend, designed to appear generous, calibrated to maintain dependence, and stipulated that Avery would receive her full inheritance only upon her 30th birthday, subject to a behavioral review conducted by estate trustees whom Diana had personally appointed. The document was signed, notarized, witnessed, and presented with the quiet confidence of a forgery executed by someone who had taken considerable time to get it right. "This is what your father wanted," Diana had said afterward to Avery in a hallway outside the conference room in the voice she used when she was making declarations that were not open to discussion. "I hope you can respect that." Avery had looked at her for a long moment. "I'd like to see the document myself." "Of course," Diana had said and smiled. "Have your attorney contact Preston." Avery did not have an attorney. Diana knew that. Avery's personal funds had been reclassified into the estate account within 72 hours of Marcus's death, requiring Diana's co-signature on any withdrawal above $200. Hearing independent legal counsel would require Diana's financial authorization, which Diana would not provide. It was a lock with no key available to the person inside the room. Over the following weeks, Diana dismantled Avery's life with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had planned this long before the body was cold. Mrs. Patricia Grove, who had worked as the estate's head housekeeper for 19 years and had known Avery since she was learning to walk, was dismissed on a Tuesday morning without severance. Her personal items were placed in a cardboard box and left at the service entrance. Patricia had called Avery in tears from the sidewalk outside the gate, and Avery had stood in the kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear and her fist pressed to her mouth and said, "Patricia, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm going to fix this." She had not yet understood that she did not have the tools to fix anything. Avery's car was sent for servicing the following week and never returned. Diana arranged a house driver instead, a man named Gareth who was less chauffeur and more surveillance, available only during hours Diana designated and reporting Avery's every departure and return. Avery's bedroom in the East Wing, the room her father had painted himself when she was 12, the two of them in old clothes with brushes and a color she had chosen called morning ash, laughing about nothing, was reassigned under the premise of renovation. The renovation never happened. Avery was moved to the third floor, to a room adjacent to the staff quarters, furnished with a twin bed and a single window that looked out over the service entrance. She had carried her mother's framed wedding photograph upstairs herself. She had set it on the narrow windowsill and stood looking at it for a long time. The isolation was designed to feel like a series of inconveniences rather than a system. No single act was dramatic enough to call the police over. Each one had a plausible explanation. Taken together, they constituted a cage built from reasonable-sounding sentences. Diana had understood something that most people didn't, that the most effective imprisonment never looked like imprisonment. It looked like management. It looked like responsibility and estate logistics and the grief-informed decisions of a new widow doing her best. What Diana could not manage, what had lived in the back of her mind like a splinter she could not reach, was the question of Theodore Harmon, Marcus's personal attorney for 22 years. The man whose name Diana had heard through an intercepted call 3 months before Marcus died, spoken in a voice that carried the particular urgency of someone making arrangements that mattered at the level of survival. She had not been able to confirm what Marcus had asked him to do, but she had understood enough to know that Harmon represented a variable she could not afford. Through a fixer named Cole, a man she had used twice before for matters she did not discuss on traceable lines, Diana had sent Theodore Harmon a message. Not a written threat, a communicated suggestion, delivered through an intermediary, that his continued professional visibility in matters related to the Caldwell estate would carry consequences his health, his reputation, and his retirement could not comfortably absorb. 4 days later, Theodore Harmon had not appeared at his office. His assistant filed a missing persons report. The police opened a file. Nothing developed. Diana had assumed, with the cool satisfaction of someone whose contingency plans had functioned correctly, that he was either frightened into permanent silence or no longer in a position to cause problems. She had not allowed herself to examine the distinction between those two outcomes too closely. She had been wrong about the outcome. She had been catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. But she would not discover that until the Thursday morning in October when a young woman walked across the lawn with 2 buttered rolls and a thermos of coffee and handed them through the iron bars of a gate that, for the first time in 2 years, was about to stop being a cage. The morning everything changed arrived without announcement, the way the most significant mornings always did. It was a Thursday in late October, and the air over the Caldwell estate held the smell of dried leaves and distant wood smoke. The sky was the specific gray of early morning before the sun had fully committed to the day, not dark, not light, but suspended between the two in a way that made everything seem slightly more consequential than it might otherwise. Avery was awake before 6. She was almost always awake before 6 now. Sleep had become unreliable in the 2 years since her father died, a resource she could access in fragments but never fully. She had taken to walking the interior perimeter of the estate grounds before the household stirred, not for exercise but for sanity, because the mornings before Diana descended the staircase in her silk robe with her agenda and her surveillance were the only hours that genuinely belonged to Avery. She was on her second loop around the east garden, her breath misting in the cold air, her hands tucked into the front pocket of her old university hoodie. Marcus had bought it for her on a campus visit when she was 16, and she had kept it for years because it still smelled faintly of the cedar from his coat closet. When she saw the man at the gate, he was outside the iron fence, on the public sidewalk, which Gareth's security team could not legally encroach upon, though Gareth himself stood 40 yards back watching with the studied hostility of someone looking for a technicality. The man was sitting on the stone curb with his back against the fence post, a canvas jacket on that had once been tan and was now the color of old concrete. His boots were worn through at the left toe. A duffel bag sat between his feet, more duct tape than fabric, the kind of bag that told you everything about the last several months of its owner's life without requiring a single word of explanation. From a distance, he looked like what the world had decided to call him. A displaced man, a forgotten man, the kind the city eventually stopped seeing. 60s, gray-bearded, gaunt with the specific thinness of long stretches of not enough. But Avery, who had inherited her mother's quality of actually looking at people rather than past them, noticed something as she approached. His hands were resting on his knees in complete stillness, not the stillness of exhaustion, the stillness of discipline. And despite the grime and the weathering, his fingers were long and precise, the hands of someone who had spent decades doing careful, deliberate work. She went inside and came back in 4 minutes. 2 buttered rolls wrapped in a dish towel. A banana from the fruit bowl taken while the morning housekeeper's back was turned. A thermos of black coffee from the carafe Marcus had programmed to brew at 5:30 every morning, and which, out of habit or stubbornness or grief, Avery had kept on the same timer even after his death. She walked to the gate and crouched slightly to pass the bundle through the narrow side opening in the iron bars. "You don't have to sit on the curb," she said. "The wall on the south side gets more sun in the mornings." "It's warmer over there." Man looked up at her. His eyes were gray and deeply, startlingly sharp, sharper, by several orders of magnitude than anything else about his appearance. He looked at her face the way people rarely looked at each other anymore, completely, without flinching, as though confirming something he had needed to confirm for a very long time. "Thank you, young lady," he said. His voice was low and controlled, carrying the measured diction of someone who had spent decades choosing words with the understanding that words were consequential things. "Do you need anything else?" Avery asked. "I can bring water." "This is more than enough," he said quietly. And then, almost beneath his breath, in a murmur she caught only because the morning was so still, "More than enough." She straightened and turned to go. She had taken 3 steps when his voice reached her again, just enough above a murmur to cross the distance. "Your mother," he said, "would be very proud of you." Avery stopped walking. The words landed somewhere deep and specific, the way only true things landed. She turned back slowly, but the man had lowered his head over the thermos, and something in the set of his shoulders told her that the door he had briefly opened was now closed. She stood in the cold for a long moment, The words sitting in her chest like a stone dropped into water that was still rippling when she walked away. She told herself he was being kind. She told herself it meant nothing. She went inside. She did not see Gareth raise his phone and begin recording. She did not see the man on the other side of the gate lift his own phone the moment she was gone, press it to his ear, and say in a voice that was nothing like the quiet murmur he had used with her. She passed. Move everything to the Bridgeport office. File Monday morning, and get me a suit. I have a court appearance to make. Diana was in the sunroom when the footage arrived on her phone. Ivory walls, fresh orchids on every surface, a cappuccino she had not yet touched. She watched the clip once, set the phone face down, then picked it up and watched it again. She was on her feet before the second viewing ended. Stop. Right here. Scroll yet if your blood is moving right now. If you already despise Diana Caldwell with every fiber of your being, and you are not yet halfway through this story, then you already know what you need to do. Subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the subscribe button and turn on all notifications, because what Diana is about to face in the next 3 scenes is the most devastating, most earned, most brutally satisfying collapse you have ever watched unfold. And I refuse to let you miss a single second of it. And drop a comment right now. Where are you watching this from? Your city, your state, your country. Let this community know it is everywhere. Drop it below. I am reading every single one now. Back to Avery's bedroom, because Diana is already on the staircase. She did not knock. She never knocked. The door to Avery's room opened so hard it struck the wall and left a mark in the plaster that would still be there months later when investigators cataloged the room. Diana stood in the frame in a cream silk robe, her phone in one hand, her hair still perfect because Diana Whitmore Caldwell was always perfect, even in her rages, especially in her rages. Behind her in the hallway, Gareth loomed with his arms crossed. 2 of the newer housemaids stood further back, young women hired after Diana had dismissed everyone who remembered Marcus, both of them now frozen with the particular stillness of people who understood that what they were witnessing was not safe to witness. "Would you like to explain to me," Diana said, and her voice was a razor wrapped in silk, "what exactly you thought you were doing this morning?" Avery was sitting on the narrow bed, still in her hoodie, the morning cold still in her skin. She looked up and kept her voice flat and even. "I gave someone breakfast. You gave a vagrant food from my kitchen, from my father's kitchen," Avery said. "In my father's house." That sentence, those 7 words, detonated something in Diana that she had been containing for 2 years. She crossed the room in 4 strides and struck Avery open-palmed across the left cheek with a force that snapped her head sideways and sent the paperback she'd been holding skidding across the floor. The sound was a crack, obscene and absolute in the small room. One of the housemaids in the hallway made an involuntary sound and pressed her hand over her mouth. The other one reached slowly, carefully into her apron pocket and found her phone by feel without lowering her eyes. Her name was Jasmine Torres. She was 22 years old. She pressed record. Avery gripped the edge of the mattress. She turned her face back to Diana slowly, deliberately, a thin red bloom rising across her cheekbone. "Your father's house," Diana repeated, the silk entirely gone from her voice now, leaving only something cold and absolute. "Your father has been in the ground for 2 years, Avery. This is my house. Everything in it is mine. The kitchen, the dishes, the bread you handed to that filthy man at my gate, all mine. I have been patient with you. I have let you live here, eat here, breathe in my home, and you want to embarrass me by feeding beggars at my gate." She reached down and grabbed Avery's collar and pulled her off the bed with a force that was shocking in a woman who looked assembled and decorative. She pulled her close enough that Avery could smell her perfume, expensive, floral, suffocating. "Who do you think you are? Let go of me," Avery said. Her voice did not shake. That, the steadiness of it, was what broke Diana's remaining restraint. She shoved Avery into the wall and struck her again with the back of her hand, knuckles and rings, across the right side of her face. Avery's vision went white for half a second. She felt the wall against her shoulder blades. She felt the heat rising immediately across her cheekbone. She did not go down. Diana grabbed a fistful of Avery's hair. This was where Avery's composure cracked, not in her face, but in her body, which convulsed once with involuntary pain and then held. "Pack what you can carry in 10 minutes, Diana said with a pleasantness that was more frightening than the violence had been. "You are done here. You can't remove me from my father's estate," Avery said through her teeth. "What legal standing will you stop me? Your attorney." Diana released her with a shove. "Go ahead. Use the phone on the estate plan I pay for. Call someone. Tell them the grieving widow had to remove the ungrateful stepdaughter who has been living free in her home for 2 years. See how that conversation goes." She straightened her robe, smoothed it. She was already composed again, the performance reconstructed in real time. 10 minutes, or Gareth carries you out. 8 minutes later, Avery Caldwell walked out of the only home she had ever known. Canvas backpack, 3 changes of clothes, her mother's wedding photograph, $43 in cash, the journal she had kept since she was 15. Her credit card declined the moment she cleared the gate. She had expected it, and the expectation did not make it less devastating. The iron gate closed behind her with a sound that she felt in her sternum. She walked 3 blocks south and sat on a bus bench in the October cold and let her hands shake for exactly 2 minutes. The right side of her face throbbed with her heartbeat. She touched it carefully and felt the heat gathered under the skin like something that had been building for a long time and had finally found a surface. She did not notice the gray-bearded man walking on the other side of the street, moving with a purpose that had nothing to do with homelessness and everything to do with a court filing that would be submitted in 4 days. She did not hear what he said into his phone, but Marcus Caldwell had heard. From wherever the dead kept their vigils, he had heard. And he had already answered. The Hartfield Women's Shelter sat on a street of practical, unremarkable buildings 2 towns from the Caldwell estate, a 3-story structure with a painted blue door, and a front desk staffed by a woman named Rhonda who had been doing this work for 16 years, and had developed the specific capacity for kindness that did not require an explanation of how someone had arrived. Avery gave her name as Avery Cole, her mother's maiden name. She did not know if Diana had people looking for her. She suspected not, because Diana's primary motivation was not Avery's suffering but Avery's invisibility. And at the moment Avery was perfectly invisible, which was exactly what Diana wanted. Still, she used the name out of an instinct she trusted more than she could explain. She was given a bed in a room she shared with 5 other women. The mattress was thin, and the room smelled of industrial cleaner and the accumulated private grief of people who had needed a place like this. She set her mother's photograph on the narrow shelf above her bed and lay down in her clothes and stared at the bunk above her and did not sleep for most of the first night. She spent the first day constructing an inventory of what she had: $43, a mother's photograph, a journal, 3 changes of clothes, and a mind that had been trained since childhood to read complicated situations with clarity. Her father had taught her that. Saturday mornings at his desk, financial reports spread between them, Marcus pointing at figures and saying, "Don't look at what they're showing you. Look at what they're not showing you. The story is always in the gap." She had been 14 the first time he said it. She had not fully understood it then. She understood it now. What Diana was not showing anyone was the real will. Avery knew it existed. She had known it. In the wordless way you sometimes know things your conscious mind hasn't yet assembled, since the moment Preston Whitfield had read the probated document aloud, and something in the arrangement of it had felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not obviously wrong, but subtly wrong the way a counterfeit bill felt wrong before you'd identified the specific flaw. Her father had been a meticulous man. A man who documented everything, who built systems and fail-safes and redundancies into every structure he managed. The idea that he had left his 24-year-old daughter at the legal and financial mercy of a woman he had known for 2 years was inconsistent with everything Avery knew about how Marcus Caldwell operated. He would not have done it. He hadn't done it. On the 3rd day, a letter arrived at the shelter's front desk addressed to Avery Cole. The name made her sit very still for a moment before she accepted the envelope from Rhonda, because the only people who knew she was here under that name were the shelter staff, and she had told no one else, which meant whoever had sent this letter had found her through means that required intention. The letterhead was printed in clean, authoritative type. HARMON and Associates, Estate and Probate Law, Bridgeport, Connecticut. She read the letter standing at the front desk. It was brief. It explained that the writer was Theodore Harmon, executor of her father's estate, and that they had met briefly the previous Thursday morning. It said that the last will and testament of Marcus Allen Caldwell, executed September 14, 2021, had been formally filed with the Fairfield County Probate Court. It said a hearing was scheduled for Monday, November 4th at 9 in the morning. It asked only that she be present. It closed with, "You have nothing to fear and everything to gain." Avery read it 3 times. The third time she pressed the letter flat against the desk with both hands and closed her eyes, and the name her father had called her, Birdie, moved through her chest like a warm current through cold water. He had known. He had planned. 3 weeks before he died, with his voice low and urgent behind a closed study door, he had set something in motion that Diana's threats and Diana's fixer and Diana's meticulous cruelty had not been able to stop. "Are you okay, honey?" Rhonda asked from behind the desk. "Yes," Avery said. She opened her eyes. "I need to find something to wear to court on Monday." Meanwhile, 6 miles north, inside the ivory-walled sunroom of the Caldwell estate, Diana was not okay. The sheriff's deputy had arrived at 9:15 on Friday morning. During a brunch Diana was hosting for 3 members of the Hartford Arts Foundation board, people whose social proximity to her she had been cultivating for months as part of the larger performance of her legitimacy. The doorbell had been answered by the morning housekeeper, and Diana had excused herself from the table with a gracious smile and met the deputy in the foyer and received the probate summons with a steadiness that cost her something real. She had gone to her private office and locked the door. Preston Whitfield answered on the second ring. "Diana, tell me what Harmon filed," she said, a pause she didn't like. "A competing will. Original document executed September 14, 2021. 2 independent notary certifications. Third-party escrow timestamp. Diana, if this is authentic, it isn't. The timestamp predates the document we probated by 11 days. Silence in the office was very loud. "Challenge it," she said. "I intend to. But Diana, I need you to understand, if Theodore Harmon stands in front of a probate judge with an original, witnessed, multiply notarized will executed 11 days before ours, the burden of proof shifts. We would need to demonstrate that Marcus was not of sound mind, or that the document was executed under duress. Or, I said challenge it, Preston." Her voice had reached the temperature of something left in a freezer too long. "That is what I pay you for." She hung up and called Cole. Voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. She stared at the phone. Cole did not go to voicemail. Cole was a man who understood that his business model depended on being available when his clients needed him to be available. In 11 years of using him across 3 separate matters, Cole had never once sent her to voicemail. A cold moved through Diana Whitmore Caldwell that she recognized, after a moment, as the specific cold of something she had not felt in a very long time. Not anger, not frustration, fear. She stood at her office window and looked out at the estate, the hedges, the rose bushes, the ivory columns, the 47 acres that she had spent 3 years engineering herself into the center of, and she forced her breathing into a controlled rhythm. She was not done. She still had Preston. She still had the forged will on record. She still had Gareth and the security team and the board appointments, and the $2.3 billion she had moved quietly into offshore accounts over the past 24 months. Money that existed now in financial structures that would take investigators years to unravel. And by then she would be somewhere else. She would have managed this. She walked back to her brunch guests and charmed them for 2 more hours with the serene, luminous ease of a woman who had absolutely nothing to be afraid of. She was magnificent at it. She had been magnificent at it for 3 years. But in the apron pocket of a 22-year-old housemaid who was already texting her cousin at the Bridgeport courthouse, 47 seconds of footage was making its way toward a destination Diana had not accounted for, carried by a girl Diana had never looked at closely enough to see. That had always been Diana's most expensive mistake. She looked at the help and saw furniture. She had never once considered that furniture had eyes. The Fairfield County Probate Court was a building that took its seriousness seriously. Gray stone facade, high-ceilinged corridors that amplified every footstep into something slightly more formal than the person making it had intended, wooden benches in the gallery that had absorbed enough human anxiety over the decades to seem faintly alive with it. It was the kind of room that reminded you, whether you wanted to be reminded or not, that what happened here was permanent. Diana arrived at 8:45 with Preston Whitfield and 2 junior associates. All 4 of them coordinated in the visual language of authority, dark professional attire, expensive watches, the particular quality of grooming that communicated that these were people accustomed to being taken seriously in rooms like this. Diana wore charcoal gray and pearl earrings and had her hair pulled into a perfect chignon. She had chosen the ensemble with the deliberateness of a woman who understood that credibility was partly costuming, and she looked, entering that courtroom, like the kind of widow whose grief had been dignified and whose legal position was unassailable. She had not expected Avery to be there. Avery was already seated in the front gallery when Diana walked in. The shelter had a donation rack with better items than most people assumed, and she had found a navy blazer that fit and dark slacks, and a pair of shoes that were exactly right. Her hair was down, the way she had always worn it, and the bruising on her right cheekbone, 3 days old now, had deepened to a specific yellow-purple combination that no amount of available foundation had been able to fully conceal. She sat with her chin level and both hands flat on her knees and did not look at the door when Diana entered. Diana saw her immediately. The sight of her, upright, composed, present when she should have been scattered and bankrupt and nowhere near this courtroom, produced a sensation in Diana's stomach that she immediately compressed into something manageable. She took her seat at the respondent's table and arranged her expression into the face of someone who considered this a minor misunderstanding they were generously giving their time to resolve. Preston leaned toward her. "The petitioner's counsel hasn't arrived yet," he murmured. "If Harmon fails to appear by 9:15, we can move for dismissal on procedural grounds." "He'll appear," Diana said. "You can't know that." "He'll appear," she said again, and the certainty in her voice came not from confidence but from the particular knowledge of someone who understood that the thing they had been dreading had not chosen to stay away. At 9:03, the door at the back of the courtroom opened. Theodore Harmon walked in. He was unrecognizable from the man at the gate, but only if you had looked at him the way most people looked at homeless men, which was to say, not at all, not really, not past the surface. He was tall. He wore a dark navy suit with the ease of a man who had worn suits for 40 years and knew exactly how they were supposed to move on a body. His gray beard was trimmed to precision. His silver hair was combed back from a face that carried its age, the way certain old buildings did, not as deterioration but as record. He carried a leather briefcase that had the quiet authority of an object that had been in many rooms like this one and had never once been on the losing side. He walked to the petitioner's table without looking at Preston Whitfield. He looked at Diana once, for exactly 1 second, with his gray razor eyes, and then he looked away and set his briefcase on the table and opened it. He removed a sealed document envelope. He set it on the table in front of him with the careful gravity of someone laying down something they had carried for a long time across a very difficult road. Diana watched his hands. They were completely steady. In the gallery, Avery watched the envelope and thought of her father's voice. "Theo, make it airtight." She thought of Marcus at his desk at 5 in the morning with his reading glasses on, working through the documents that had built an empire before most people were awake. She thought of him on the back veranda on summer nights, holding his glass without drinking, looking at the garden. She thought of the sparrow on the hospital window ledge, 24 years ago, waiting to meet a girl who hadn't yet arrived. The judge entered. Everyone rose. Theodore Harmon was called to the petitioner's table and spoke for 6 minutes without consulting a single note. He described the circumstances of the will's execution, the date, the location, the witnesses, the independent notaries. He outlined, with methodical precision, the threats communicated to him through an intermediary following Marcus Caldwell's death, threats he had documented in a written record that was now entered as evidence. Along with supporting communications, he had preserved across encrypted platforms during 6 months of deliberate self-concealment. He presented the vault records from Harmon and Associates in Bridgeport. He presented the safe deposit box certification from the private bank in New Haven, held under a trust entity whose name Diana had never encountered. He presented the digital escrow filing timestamp. Preston Whitfield objected 3 times. Each objection was overruled with increasing brevity, which was itself a kind of verdict rendered piece by piece before the main event. "Can you summarize," the judge said, "the material differences between the document you've presented and the instrument previously admitted to probate?" Theodore opened the sealed envelope. He removed 5 pages. He turned to the 3rd page. He looked up at the courtroom with the expression of a man who had been waiting to do this for 2 years and intended to do it correctly. "I will read Clause 9 in full, Your Honor, as it is directly determinative of these proceedings." Diana's hands disappeared beneath the table. "Before I read," Theodore said, and his voice carried the distinctive quiet of someone who did not need volume to fill a room, "I want to offer brief context, because Marcus Caldwell was a man who believed context was the difference between information and meaning." He paused. 3 weeks before his death, Marcus called me and said the following. He said, "Theo, Diana is not what she appears to be. I don't have proof yet that I can hold in my hands. But I know my wife the way you know a storm before the clouds arrive by the change in the air. I need you to build something she cannot dismantle, something that does not depend on what I can prove, something that depends on who my daughter is." Theodore lowered the page slightly and looked at the room. "Those were his words. I wrote them down the moment the call ended, and that transcription is also entered as evidence." He lifted the page again. Clause 9. Courtroom was the kind of silence that rooms rarely achieved. Avery's hands were flat on her knees. She pressed them down and breathed through her nose and kept her eyes on Theodore Harmon and did not blink. Theodore Harmon read Clause 9 in the measured, unhurried voice of a man who understood that some words, once spoken into a room of record, could not be unspoken, could not be managed or reframed or absorbed by the kind of damage control that Diana Caldwell had deployed so successfully against every other obstacle that had presented itself in the last 3 years. Clause 9, he began. Conditional behavioral standard for estate distribution. "It is my considered belief that the woman I have married, Diana Christine Whitmore Caldwell, entered this marriage with the deliberate intent to position herself as primary beneficiary of this estate upon my death, and that she will, following my death, take actions designed to marginalize, impoverish, isolate, and ultimately remove my daughter, Avery Caldwell, from her rightful inheritance and from the home in which she was born. I cannot prove this at the time of this document's execution. I choose instead to construct a legal mechanism that renders the question of proof irrelevant." A sound moved through the gallery. Soft, collective, involuntary. Diana did not move. "Therefore," Theodore continued, "I establish the following condition, which shall be the governing standard for the entirety of this estate's distribution. In the event that any person, named or unnamed in this document, presents before an independent witness of professional standing, a genuine, unsolicited act of compassion directed toward a person of no social or financial utility to Avery Caldwell, said act to be observed and attested to by Theodore James Harmon, J.D., as the appointed independent witness, then the following provisions shall immediately take effect. 1. The full value of Caldwell Global Holdings and all subsidiary assets, totaling no less than $500 billion at the time of my death, shall transfer entirely and without condition into a trust controlled exclusively by Avery Caldwell. 2. All previously probated documents purporting to represent my last wishes shall be declared null and void by the authority of this instrument. 3. All persons found to have participated in the creation or submission of fraudulent estate documents in my name shall be referred immediately to the appropriate state and federal authorities. Preston Whitfield had stopped writing. His pen rested against the yellow legal pad at an angle that suggested his hand had simply stopped cooperating. Theodore lowered the page. I was the independent witness. I observed Avery Caldwell approach a man she believed to be homeless at her father's gate on the morning of October 24th. She brought him food and coffee without being asked, without knowing who he was, without any expectation of return. She offered him a warmer place to sit. When she turned to leave and I spoke to her, she did not ask my name, my story, or my need. She simply stood in the cold and listened. He folded the page with precise hands. That was the act. Marcus Caldwell wrote the clause before he died because he knew, not hoped, not guessed, but knew that his daughter would do exactly what she did. He built her that way. He and her mother built her that way together. Silence in the courtroom lasted 4 full seconds. Then Diana's chair scraped back and she stood and said, "This is fraudulent," and her voice had finally, completely lost all its silk. What remained was something raw and structural, the sound of a performance ending without a curtain. "This document is a fabrication. Harmon fabricated Ms. Caldwell," the judge said. "He fabricated this entire Ms. Caldwell." The judge's voice carried the tone of a person who had decided something. "Sit down." Diana sat. Or rather, Diana's legs returned her to her chair because the alternative was remaining standing in a room that was no longer arranged in her favor, that was in fact arranged against her in ways she was only beginning to fully calculate. The calculation was not going well. Because the judge had not finished, and neither had Theodore Harmon. And in the gallery, a young woman named Jasmine Torres, 22 years old, a housemaid Diana had never looked at closely enough to see, had already submitted her 47 seconds of footage to the court clerk before the hearing began, at the instruction of Theodore's assistant. Through a connection Jasmine's cousin had facilitated from inside the Bridgeport courthouse 3 days earlier. The footage played on the courtroom monitor. There was no sound problem. There was no angle problem. The resolution was crisp and merciless and complete. Diana Caldwell's palm connecting with Avery Caldwell's face. Diana's rings connecting with the other side. Diana's hand in Avery's hair, pulling her across a room, in a house Avery had been born in, while 2 women watched from a hallway and one of them recorded and one of them pressed her hand over her mouth. The footage ran for 47 seconds and did not require narration. 3 people in the gallery stood up during the playback. One of them was a journalist from the Hartford Courant who had been tipped off about the hearing, and was now writing with the velocity of someone who understood what they were holding. Another was a woman from the gallery public seating, who had simply come in to wait for a different hearing, and had stayed because the room had acquired the particular gravity of something historical occurring in real time. Diana's face during the playback was the most expensive thing she had ever shown in public. She could not rearrange it fast enough. The calculation was visible in her eyes. The assessment of what this footage meant, what it cost, what could still be salvaged, and then the assessment collapsing into something she could not name because she had spent 41 years successfully avoiding the experience of complete, irreversible exposure, and the thing it felt like was nothing she had ever prepared for. Preston Whitfield leaned toward her and said something into her ear. She did not respond. Her pearl earrings caught the courtroom light. What Preston was telling her was that Cole had not gone to voicemail because he was busy or unavailable. Cole had gone to voicemail because Cole had accepted a cooperation agreement with federal investigators 3 days earlier. Cole had been under surveillance for 5 months. Diana's communications with him, the messages about Theodore Harmon, the suggestions communicated through Cole's intermediary, the arrangements made regarding what Diana had described to Cole as the documentation problem, had been logged, recorded, and were now part of a federal file that the FBI's Financial Crimes Division had been building in parallel with the probate case. Cole, it emerged, had kept records of everything. Cole understood that the only reliable protection in his line of work was documentation of the people who hired you, held in a location they couldn't access. The judge referred the matter of the fraudulent will to the state attorney's office before the morning session ended. The federal charges, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, criminal intimidation of a legal witness, and the movement of $2.3 billion in estate assets through offshore structures that forensic accountants had been quietly unraveling for 6 weeks, were filed before noon. Gareth, presented with the footage and the federal filing and the offer of a reduced charge in exchange for full cooperation, agreed to cooperation within the hour. He had 17 months of security logs that documented every restriction Diana had imposed on Avery, every denied withdrawal, every monitored departure, every instruction to screen her calls. Diana was escorted from the courthouse by 2 federal agents at 12:43 in the afternoon. She was still in the charcoal blazer. She still had the pearl earrings on. Her hair was still in the chignon. But the composure was gone, not gradually, not in pieces, but completely, the way a structure collapsed when the foundational thing that held it together was finally removed. She walked between the agents through the courthouse corridor, past the journalist who was already on his phone, past the wooden benches that had absorbed decades of human reckoning. And she looked straight ahead with the expression of someone who had just discovered that the building they had lived in for 3 years had not been a fortress at all. It had been a trap, built by a dead man, sprung by his daughter's breakfast. Avery sat in the front gallery for a long time after the room emptied. Theodore Harmon gathered his papers slowly, deliberately, and then he walked to the gallery and sat down in the seat beside her, not across from her, beside her, the way someone sat when they had a great deal to say and no urgency about when to start. "He loved you very much," Theodore said. "I know," Avery said. Her voice was steady. "He was always doing that, planning for things he hoped would never happen. Called you Birdie." Avery looked at him. "He told you that? The morning we finalized the document, he told me about the sparrow on the hospital window. He said Alina had laughed and said the bird was waiting to meet you." Theodore folded his hands on his knee, the precise and careful hands she had noticed through the iron bars. He said, "That bird knew something. My daughter has always been worth waiting for." Avery pressed her lips together. She looked at the courtroom ceiling, the high, formal ceiling of a room built to hold permanent things, and she breathed in once, slowly, and let the grief and the gratitude and the long, costly love of a father who had seen everything coming and loved her enough to build a future for her inside the wreckage he couldn't prevent. She let all of it move through her fully, without resistance. Outside the courthouse, a journalist was already filing. Inside a federal building across the city, Diana Caldwell's offshore accounts were being frozen one by one, a sequence of institutional finalities that made the sound, if you listened closely enough, of gates closing. 11 weeks from today, on the morning Avery turned 25, the full transfer of Caldwell Global Holdings would execute automatically per the trust instrument. $500 billion, 17 industries, 4 continents. The life's work of a man who had loved 2 women completely, and had spent the last weeks of his life making sure that the one who remained would be protected by something Diana Whitmore Caldwell's cruelty and cunning could not reach: a clause, a condition. A daughter's character, written into law. Marcus Caldwell had known he was running out of time. He had not known exactly how Diana would move against Avery, but he had known she would move, and he had built a mechanism that didn't require him to predict the specific act, only the specific heart. He had bet everything on who his daughter was. He had been right. The charcoal blazer and the pearl earrings made the evening news. The headline used the word empire. The photograph showed Diana between 2 agents, her face in the courtroom corridor, stripped of every performance she had ever given. It was the most honest photograph anyone had ever taken of her. 3 months later, Diana Whitmore Caldwell was sentenced to 19 years on 7 federal counts. The estate was restored. The staff were rehired. Patricia Grove returned on a Tuesday morning, and Avery met her at the front door, not the service entrance, and they stood in the foyer of the Caldwell mansion and held onto each other for a long time without speaking, which was the most articulate either of them could manage. Avery moved back into the east wing. She had the room repainted the color her father had chosen, morning ash, and she hung her mother's wedding photograph on the wall between the two windows where the light hit it in the morning, and she sat on the floor beneath it on her first night back with a cup of black coffee she'd brewed at 5:30, the way Marcus always had, and she talked to both of them for a while, about everything that had happened, about how it felt to have been loved with such forethought, such structural devotion, such extraordinary patience from beyond the veil of death. She talked until the coffee was cold. Then she went to bed in her father's house, in her mother's light, and slept without interruption for the first time in 2 years. Outside, the iron gate stood open. It had not been closed since the morning Avery came home. Marcus Caldwell had built a $500 billion empire across 4 decades and 17 industries. But the thing he had built with the greatest care, the thing Diana's lawyers and fixers and forged documents and offshore accounts had never come close to touching, was a daughter who would hand a stranger breakfast on a cold October morning without asking for anything in return. That was the will. That was always the will. The end of Part 1. Part 2. The federal trial, Diana's complete unraveling, and the secret about Marcus's death that changes everything. If you made it here, if you felt every single moment of this, then you already know what to do. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. This community is everywhere, and we want to see your city on that screen. Part 2 is coming, and Diana Caldwell's story is not finished being taken apart.